Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on the Homeric questions. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to be taking our first look at one of the greatest writers or singers the world has ever seen. And that, of course, is Homer, the composer of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, is he a composer? Is he an author? When did he write? Where did he write? What's his deal in general? These are the questions that we are going to be looking at today. And if you think it's a little weird that this is coming right on the end of the Dark Ages, when things looked about as bad as they could for ancient Greece, well, there's a reason for that, and we'll talk about that as well. What we're going to do today is we're going to recap this kind of transition from the Bronze to the Dark Age. Then we'll take a little look at what we call the 8th century Renaissance. And we'll go into more depth on this later, but I'll give you a little bit of idea for what's going on in Greece at the time that Homer's composing his epics. Then we're going to dig into what questions scholars have had about Homer and how he produced some of the most famous epics the world has ever seen. Then we'll look actually at some of the modern scholars and how they have helped us understand how this is done, right? Without any sort of computer or anything like that, the guy composes something that's like 500 pages long. How do you do that? And we'll look at the scholarship associated with that. And then finally, we'll bring this together with some concluding thoughts. So, from Bronze Age to Dark Age, let's go ahead and situate ourselves chronologically. Remember, the Bronze Age is starting somewhere around 3000 BC, lasting for almost 2,000 years, all the way up until around 1200 BC, when we see destruction across the Mediterranean. Now, those cultures, right, the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece, the Egyptians in the Nile River Valley, the Minoans on the island of Crete, and a whole bunch of different civilizations in the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys, everybody from the Sumerians to the Akkadians and Babylonians and Assyrians, and the Hittites in Anatolia as well. So, around 1200, right, we get destruction all over the place in Greece, along the Levant, along the coast of the Mediterranean in general, and even some of the interior sites at places like Hattusa and Sippar down here. And what that ends up leading to, right, is not just a very, very temporary kind of diminution of grandeur of the Bronze Age, but it leads to something that we call the Dark Ages. And this is kind of large-scale collapse in terms of the sophistication of government, the complexity of society, the complexity of material culture as well. And so no longer do we have the palaces at sites like Knossos. Instead, the best thing that we've got is about a 100-foot-long kind of wooden burial structure for one of the heroes of the Dark Age at the site of Lefkandi. So a huge decrease in the level of complexity across the Greek world. Now, after 500 years of this, 400 years of this, what ends up happening? Well, something scholars have called the 8th century Renaissance. Now, not exactly the same as our Leonardo da Vinci Renaissance right here, but a Renaissance nonetheless in the sense that people are starting to come out of the Dark Ages. And what we end up seeing is a wide variety of different things. So we see the return of kind of more sophisticated material culture. So if you look at something like this, you can see that people, right? People and animals and things like that have returned to the decoration on ceramics. During the Dark Ages, it was very, very simple geometric patterns. Now the geometry has remained, but they've started making geometric-looking people. In addition to that, we've got colonization. So population is growing. They're moving out of their little kind of homeland of Greece right here and settling across the Mediterranean at sites in southern Italy and Sicily, way up into France and into Spain, even into the Black Sea area, kind of way over here. And accompanying that colonization is the development of writing. So we get our first writing in like 400 years. And we're going to talk more about this later, but this is really, really cool. So remember before with the Linear B tablets, what we've got are accounting documents, right? Super boring to read. So check some of them out, but they're not great. And here what we've got all of a sudden is we've got literature. The earliest thing we have from Greek writing is this inscription here that basically is a reference to one of the stories from Homer's Iliad. So before the Iliad was ever written down, our earliest piece of writing is already referencing one of the scenes from the Iliad. So that's the context in which Homer is writing. In this 8th century BC, the 700s BC, that's when we think the Iliad and the Odyssey first kind of came into the form that we know them today. And that doesn't necessarily mean the written form, but in terms of the whole scope of the story, we think it's around the 8th century BC. Now, even though we think that, there are a lot more questions than answers. And what we're going to start with today is by kind of talking through what some of those main questions are. So something as basic as, did the Trojan War actually happen, right? The greatest set of epics the world has ever seen concern the Trojan War. And we have no idea whether it actually happened or not. In addition, Homer, right? The greatest epic poet the world has ever seen. And nobody knows whether he's a real person. There's actually kind of a running joke that goes like, a scholar says, I just discovered Homer didn't write the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the scholar's buddy says, oh yeah, who did? He's like, oh, it was a different guy. Same name as Homer, just different dude. And I don't know. It's not a funny joke, but scholars get a kick out of it. And the reason they can do that, right, is we know so little about Homer besides his name, right? The Greeks thought it was a dude named Homer who wrote these things, and so that's what we've adopted. And so we've started asking, who really did author these things? Was it actually one person, many people? Did somebody actually write them down, or were they sung? Was there an authoritative version of these things? And how do these fit into the bigger picture of epics in the ancient Greek world? So let's start at the top. So Trojan War, did this happen? This is still something that's debated, and very likely we're never going to have a definitive answer. We did see that the site of Troy itself exists, and this is at the site of Hisarlik in western Turkey, fairly close to the Aegean coast. And what we see here is that Troy, the site itself, is actually broken into a bunch of different levels, stemming from way, way, way before there was ever a palace at a site like Mycenae, right, around 2500 BC, all the way until Rome takes over thousands of years later. Now we do see that there are two destruction layers right around the end of the Bronze Age. So we see one around 1250 BC, we see another one around 1175 BC, and scholars have basically suggested that if there was a Trojan War, if there was some sort of big war between the mainland Greeks, the Mycenaeans, and the kind of Greeks living on the west coast of Turkey, right, the Trojans over here, that it's probably one of these destruction layers that attests to that war. So basically, we don't know for sure. There is evidence of destruction. If it did happen, it's probably associated with one of those two destruction layers around Troy 7 here, but we just don't know. Now, an equally important question, right? Did the guy that we credit with writing the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer, was he ever a real dude? This seems like a very, very basic question, but we still don't know the answer. There are a couple different possibilities out there. So one is that he was a real actual dude. There was one guy out there who composed the Iliad, who composed the Odyssey, and then passed them down in the form that we know them today, and his name was Homer. That's kind of how we tend to approach things, without looking into it, right? We just assume it was an actual person. But another possibility is that this was actually a group of people, right? Homer was kind of a name given to a group of different bards, right? People who would go around singing for aristocratic families. And it's these different people who kind of all contribute something different to the story. And so in reality, rather than having a single Homer, he's actually kind of many different people. Another possibility is that he never existed at all, right? So there was never any real person named Homer or group of people named Homer in antiquity. It's simply something that later Greeks made up as a way to attribute authorship of these poems that became so fundamental in their own lives in ancient Greece. So, most scholars today tend to think that there was there was somebody or some small group of people who did come up with a definitive version of these kind of poems. And that's because these things are so kind of nicely put together that it must have had some sort of authorship rather than just a total amalgamation of a bunch of different stories. It wouldn't have fit together that nicely if they were totally random stories being put together. Most scholars also think, though, that it was probably a different dude who put it together for the Iliad than put it together for the Odyssey. And that's kind of cool, right? Like, so we think of it as Homer doing both. We think based on the way these stories are put together, the trajectory of the stories, the religion involved in the stories, the caricature of people in the stories, that it was probably somebody different who did this for each one of them. Now, if there was a Homer, right, and he's writing, let's deal with the Iliad here, when was he writing? When were these things composed? And the thing is, when we looked at Mycenaean culture, we saw a little bit of inspiration for Homer, these kind of warrior kings living in these fortified palaces on mainland Greece. And we do think that to some extent, Homer was certainly trying to capture these guys when he was writing or composing these stories. And for example, there are several things in material culture that only exist in the Bronze Age. So these boar's tusk helmets, which we saw as evidence in burials at places like Mycenae, they only exist in the Bronze Age. Once the Bronze Age collapses, there are no more boar's tusk helmets in the Dark Ages. Right? They don't exist anymore. So that would suggest that Homer was kind of operating very early on. But then we get other things that only happen much, much later. So for example, one of the things that we end up seeing is that we see that people are cremated in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And that cremation only starts up around the 8th century BC. Before that, people were buried. So if you were actually writing back in the Bronze Age, we would expect that when people die, they're buried. But instead, we see that they're cremated. And so what we think is happening is he's writing sometime in the 8th century or composing sometime in the 8th century. But he's trying to recall the heroes of hundreds of years before that, these Bronze Age heroes. And some of the material culture he gets right, and sometimes his own customs, right, the customs of his own day, end up taking over. Now, if he's writing in the 8th century, like where is he doing this? We tend to think that it's in Ionia. And when we say Ionia, all right, we're talking about the western coast of Turkey, essentially. And the reason that we think that, well, we got two reasons here. One is dialect. So the way that he actually writes, the way that the words are put together, just like a dialect in English today or something like that, it tends to correspond to this area of the ancient Greek world. The other kind of reason is kind of funny. He's pretty good at geography. When he talks about geography, he's pretty good at this part of the world, right? The kind of eastern part of the Greek world or western Turkey here, he's pretty solid on his geography. When he starts talking about things like Ithaca and places of way western Greece over here, his geography gets really, really sloppy, all right? And so he's just much more familiar with what's going on with this place. And so again, we think that he's probably writing in the 8th century or composing in the 8th century somewhere in western Turkey. Now, the next question is, what was he doing here, right? Is the image that we should have of like Homer like over a scroll, right? We see that there is writing in the 8th century. Our very first written evidence comes from the 8th century after the Dark Ages. So is he over there doing that, putting together these epics, or is he singing these songs? How is he doing this? And what we end up thinking is that probably Homer is a bard, right? He is an oral poet going around from aristocratic house to aristocratic house and singing for money, right? He's telling these tales as a way to make a living and compiling different stories and then formulating them into a coherent narrative. Now the question is why, right? Why do we think that he was singing instead of writing things down? Now one of the reasons is that he was, the first written evidence for the Iliad, right, is like 500 BC. So a couple hundred years after Homer. We don't have any evidence of anybody even trying to write it down before that. But then that raises the question, how do you do it, right? When we publish the Iliad today, it's 400 pages long, right? How do you memorize a 400-page poem so that you can perform it orally for people? And this is exactly the question that this guy, Milman Parry, was interested in. Now, Milman Parry is he's a classicist in the early 20th century, and he wanted to know, right, how do you compose a 15-hour-long epic poem and have the accuracy to perform it time after time after time with the same story, right, without losing the details? How can you keep that consistency over something so long? And the way that Milman Parry decided to approach this research was not by reading a bunch of Greek or Latin or something like that. It was by traveling the world. And what he ended up doing was looking for people around the world who did something similar to what he thought Homer did, right? Singing these really long epic poems. And in the former Yugoslavia, in modern-day Bosnia, he ended up finding what we call the Guzzlari, or what they called themselves the Guzzlari, these oral poets who would sing for hours and hours and hours and hours, and yet be able to tell the same tale again and again and again in the exact same order. And he particularly befriended this guy, Avdo Mlađenović, and listened to him and recorded him and talked to him about the composition process. And because this is happening in the early 20th century, we can actually have we have like video evidence of what this looked like and sounded like. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at that now. Okay, and so when Milman Parry first started studying this, he noticed two things that made him think that these had to be sung, right? And those two things were A, sometimes you had these things called weak joins, right? You'd have the same very, very minor character die twice in the same book, right? Hundreds of pages apart. The other thing that you had was you had these kind of repetitive epithets and formulas. And this is exactly what he found when he talked to Avdo Mlađenović about how Avdo created his own epic poetry. It's the use of these epithets, which is a fancy name for like a nickname, for different characters in the poem. And so when you have Achilles, you have swift-footed Achilles, but you also have Achilles, breaker of men, or Achilles, loved by the gods. And the way that you choose which epithet or which name you go with in any given circumstance is based on the meter of the poem. And in classical epic poetry, that meter is known as dactylic hexameter, which means it's got 6 different feet. And it would go dum diddy dum diddy dum diddy dum diddy dum dum. And so based on where you need the name and how much of that meter, right, how many feet you need that nickname to take up, you can choose the appropriate nickname. So on a line-by-line level, it's these epithets that take up different amounts of meters, right, different amounts of feet, that allow you to compose on the fly. Now, over the scope of the entire poem, this works similarly with formulas. And so when you have something like a feasting scene, that feasting scene operates in the exact same manner every single time. So you can use that formula anytime you get a feast, plug that thing in there full sail, and then that will mean that you can use this kind of pre-prepared part for the poem. So for a feast, it might be, so first you set the table, then you bring in the food, then the host gives a toast, and then they eat, and then everybody's drunk on wine. And every time you get a feast, it follows that exact same formula. And so that's what allows you to kind of build almost like Lego blocks, right, the entire epic poem. Okay, so a few concluding thoughts here. So when we look at Homer, even thousands of years later, there's still a bunch of unanswered questions. Basic stuff like whether the Trojan War actually existed, or whether Homer was actually a real dude. And while some of those things may not have conclusive answers today, there are some things that we have learned, right? So we've learned about the kind of composition process of epic poetry and how kind of modern Guzzlari of Bosnia can inform us about ancient Greek epic poetry, hundreds of miles away. We've also seen that Homer's operating at a time where Greece is rapidly changing, right? They're long gone are the days of the Bronze Age. For 400 years, they've lived in something called the Dark Ages. And finally, right, with things like colonization and cool new art and things like writing, they're emerging from those Dark Ages. And Homer is part of that process during what we call the 8th century Renaissance. And we'll look more into that as we get into the rest of Greek history. But thanks for going with me today as we've tackled the Homeric questions.